Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. This short podcast is about a book. It is a book review for the most part. It is called Genocide in Paraguay. It is a book that is out of print by Richard Arens. It is a short book. It's actually a very good book. It discusses the genocide in Paraguay and who is responsible for this genocide in Paraguay. We're going to read chapter 4, which is Paraguayan realities, that discusses the actions that happened. But before we start that, we're going to discuss some things. Okay, the Iran war has brought up an issue, which is what is the motivation for the U.S. government and the Western coalition that is not directly involved, but is definitely feeding the U.S. For the Iran war. Okay, let's just discuss oil for a minute. Oil is the white supremacist commodity that the West uses for racial oppression. The nexus of oil companies are in white nations that are colonial regimes. These include very racist countries that have had a racist past, such as Britain, the United States, France, Germany, Portugal, and the Netherlands. They want to make money under the guise of racial subordination, racist exploitation, and even racist theft and murder. America is the leader of this nexus. The requirement is the American government needs to control the colonial regime, the colonial property, in order to ensure oil being their natural resource commodity. Companies then will go and pay their white capitalists, plunder and rape the resources of the land, and maintain the population in an impoverished state of racial oppression. They're white mass murdering frauds. It's okay if you want to take oil, but killing 15 million people like were murdered in Indochina for the sake of Western oil monopoly is fraud. It is fraud, and it is acceptable. It is completely acceptable for colonial nations to do that. It's not something unusual. That is why it is very dangerous action by the people who are in charge of the colonial regimes. Remember, drying up the ocean for a few fish is kind of extreme approach to making money, as they did in Indochina. For the few gorillas that they killed, they wanted to, destroy the ocean or dry up the whole ocean, which is wage war on the civilian population of Indochina. They are white, racist, savage, supremacist quacks. These issues apply to Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Chile, Brazil, Venezuela, Mexico, Indochina, and even possibly China. But the most important place is South America. Be very aware that Argentina, Chile, Brazil, Venezuela, and Mexico are oil-rich deposit nations, and those countries are very susceptible to U.S. imperialism and U.S. colonial exploitation, racist oppression, and racist mass murder by the U.S. government. Remember their past experience there. We're going to just discuss, you already know that Venezuela has been taken over. So we're going to continue, basically. I just want to, bring up one more issue, and that's with regard to this podcast. Okay, the genocide in Paraguay is a sore spot, it seems, for the U.S. government, because anything they do that is not documented in history books and is not in their history compendium, they seem to, think is illegal or incorrect. Note the American government seems to be very interested in this genocide in Paraguay. The American frauds are very interested in this podcast. We know that this is a nosy group of whites of the American government. There's nothing you can do, but unfortunately they're interested in a conversation that I don't really want to talk to them about. We're not trying to solicit them for this conversation. It's a secretive but public conversation on YouTube that the U.S. government has no business requesting information about. We don't request to know about what the Ku Klux Klan speaks about in its private meetings of the U.S. government racist wings, and what they speak about in their private ethnic hate and sadistic murder wings of the U.S. government's racist wings in its Washington district. We don't ask for anything that the secretive U.S. government does in terms of racist oppression and racist exploitation. So this is something that they should not be asking for. Similarly, they should know about and want to know about. They should not want to know about or know about their depiction of the genocidal actions in other places. However, it's important for people to know about these things. We have to accept that they are in a position where they want to invade people's privacy and learn more and more about the discussions in public media like YouTube. So they are introducing fascism and destroying the only small democracy that exists in America. It is a group of racist white savages, a racist group of white fascist pro-Hitler savages that don't understand that they are invading people's privacy and understanding what they're speaking about. They're destroying the fabric of democracy and creating a white supremacist fascist ideology and an ethnic hate campaign. We are not asking them to learn about their genocides. We are simply putting them on YouTube for people who want to know it. People have the right to know what governments do. All governments understand this. And if this conflicts with their fascist, anti-ethnic, sadistic agendas, then they shouldn't look at it. We're not soliciting them or people to understand about the genocides. We're not soliciting anyone to watch our videos or understand the genocide. So you see, the problem with the American administration is that because of their need to obsessively, sadistically invade people's privacy and sadistically cause mass murder of ethnics all across the board, they can't help themselves but stick their noses in places they don't belong. And when they feel they get offended, they want to slaughter and make things even. It is a racist group of white savages, sadistic, mentally deranged butchers. Their nonstop harassment of private conversations on YouTube by U.S. citizens, it is an example of a fascist fraud democracy, sham democracy, and makes South African democracy of the yesteryear look legitimate. So that's just a short discussion about, the kinds of things that, people have to do to make these YouTube conversations go on. But, for the most part, that is, ultimately what, I wanted to talk about. Now I'm going to go through the actual podcast here, which is Paraguayan Realities. I'm going to just read the book and, I'll finish the book and I'll, make some statements at the end. These white pages, which I have been asked to contribute to this extraordinary book on the genocide of the Achi Indians, may be called the mise-en-scene for a harrowing tragedy. The setting for such a tragedy should convey a suggestion, preferably a foreshadowing of the shocking denouncement. And so indeed it does in the case of Paraguay. For that country's contemporary social, political, and economic scene is a sinister one. To write on the genocidal climate of Paraguay is therefore not an easy task, precisely because of the excess of material. The archives of the Inter-American Association for Democracy and Freedom overflow with contributory evidence, past and present. Declarations of the tortured, futile protest to the presumed protectors of the human person, the regional and international organization, numberless lists of the summarily imprisoned, with details of their arbitrary confinements and torture, many since 1956, without trial, names of prisons and concentration camps, covering the country like a spider web. It is a voluminous substantiation of brutality which finally reaches its apogee in the pages devoted to the Achi Indians. In truth, our chapter may be regarded as the rather general examination of the diseased body, while the story of the Achi Indians is a clinical microscopic study of its most malignant cell. And, the U.S. government is responsible for this genocide in Paraguay. They supplied, ammunition, military hardware and equipment and guns and, police training to the Paraguayan government to, allow them to murder the Achi Indians in a genocide. Even as these pages are being written, the obligato of imprisonments and torture goes on. Priests, students, and anthropologists, educators are all drawn into the maw of hidden dooming centers of interrogation and confinement. Their stories, of course, would not reach the outside world were it not for a few courageous protesters within Paraguay and the more than 500,000 refugees who keep their vigil on the borders of their neighboring countries, Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil, listening for the news of their families. And few are the families whose members have not been ravished, imprisoned, or humiliated during the whole course of the years that Alfredo Stroessner and his civilian and military satraps have ruled like the incubi of terror and vampirism over their people. General Stroessner was the president of Paraguay, the chief rogue right-wing puppet that the U.S. government installed for mass murder of the Paraguayan peoples. They wanted to ethnically cleanse the Paraguayan people of the Indians as well as the mixed mestizos, because of that's their racist, purity. That's their racial purity. I've been asked more than once to tell of my long and bitter captivity. I refrained out of fear of the persecution, which extends even beyond the country itself, through a shameful international conspiracy. Words seemed almost superfluous, but now I feel that it is necessary to express myself in homage to the martyrs of the tyrant, those who have gone and those who are still alive, the many of the latter who remain in their dreadful imprisonment. Within that total prison into which our country has been transformed, where human values have ceased to exist, my words are directed above all to the entire Paraguayan people, in whose devotion to freedom and justice I never lost faith for a single moment, even during my long entombment when the cowardly torturers tore my flesh and humiliated my soul. I can say that the morale and courage needed to bear beatings, the electric needle, the suspension in putrid water, and sword slashes from servile military men must be drawn from one's love for the people and one's profound confidence in the struggle and the future, as well as for the certainty of eventual triumph. One must feel oneself an inseparable part of heroic and immortal people. During innumerable interminable nights in the 6-by-9-foot cell, which I shared with 3 other prisoners, I asked myself, what terrible sin have we Paraguayans committed to be thus brutally deprived of our dignity and liberty? Only men completely devoid of human values could commit such grave wrongs against the people, humble and industrious men and women of our country. Any indictment of the regime of oppression, corruption, and betrayal is too moderate. The misery there is so evident. The hunger is acute, the anguish so profound that the only wish of the Paraguayan people is now to survive. In contrast to this, one notes the opulence and the luxury of the despot and his followers and the fortunes amassed by them through plunder, crimes, contraband, or narcotics, that new industry which is now the most valued item of the export of the tyrant. He is talking about the United States government planted General Stroessner. He is talking, this is an activist. This is a person who is imprisoned by General Stroessner for the sake of, Major Vicente Alberto Maidana Arias, a dissenter in Paraguay, who was condemning the regime for its brutal oppression of the, people of Paraguay, the Indians, the Achi Indians in Paraguay, who were genocided by the U.S. government. The white racist, mass-murdering, sadistic, cruel, detached, anti-ethnic, criminal butchers of the United States of America. The illegitimate butchers of the U.S. government. His is one of the thousands of Paraguayan voices in the wilderness that cry out for justice, apparently unheard of in a political world where national and international conspiracies keep tyrants to power and manage to muffle out the distant cries. By what cumulative process, one may ask, did this once idyllic land, pre-Columbian Paraguay, finally become a slough of despair? Let us see. Of themselves, many of the features of the Paraguayan tyranny are not unique. They repeat aspects of the usual history of conquest and colonialism, further compounded by human cupidity. The chronicles of Latin America itself are replete with variations of the tales of oppression, as of course they are in any other region of the planet. But each national variation has a special tonality, so to speak, according to the physical ambience of the country, the character of its conquerors and despoilers, as well as the degree to which its rapaciousness is exposed in the eyes of the outside world. In whichever of these terms we contemplate the Paraguayan dictatorship, it may be stated without reserve that even in the repetitious history of Latin American oppression, Paraguay has been uniquely susceptible to its germination and development. From its discovery by the Spaniards through the subsequent history, in the terms of liberty and human dignity, the country has moved toward its present virtual political putrescence. Under the present regime, it is almost totally unredeemed. This is referring to the U.S. government. They are the ones that installed the military dictatorship and General Stroessner many years ago in Paraguay. He has mass murdered his people just under the direction of Washington, D.C., the racist butcher, white, frauds of the U.S. government, the racist frauds of the American government have caused mass murder in Paraguay. For readers unfamiliar with the evolution of present-day Latin America, it might be instructive to mention briefly some generalities of the hemispheric framework within which Paraguay is a lesser fragment. Among the 20 so-called Latin American countries which compose the southern hemisphere, there is no state that actually repeats the pattern of another. It is as though each fragmented, which ultimately became a country, had been a crucible into which multiple ingredients were thrown, some alike, but others sufficiently divergent to produce their own characteristic molds. Among the simple ingredients might be common language and the European migratory infusion from Spain or elsewhere, but mixed with these infinite diversity of other matter, genealogy, topology, pre-Columbian substrata, or immigratory elements. The results that emerge from any one of the 20 composites are discernibly different from the other 19. And so Paraguay's story is no mere repetition of that. Its 19 neighbors. Its difference has not been the mere fact its dictatorship, for dictatorship is endemic to virtually all Latin America because of the United States. But this virulent disease of man's oppression of his fellows manifests and develops in each state to its own kind and degree, and the special fertilizing conditions propitious to this growth, the United States of America plants the seeds for this growth. Latin American dictatorships almost invariably begin with some type of occupation, a usurpation of power from within or without, but both aim to condition the folk to subordination. Sometimes these occupations are pragmatic and overt, as in the case of classical Caribbean dictatorships in the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, and Haiti, where the United States military occupations left behind some local constabulary despot who decided to procreate a dynasty. In these Caribbean nations, the condition left behind have been so propitious so as to nourish successive decades of caudillo, where there were rebellious indigenous peoples, such as Araucanos in Chile, the Chilejas in Colombia, or one of the two peoples of the Altiplano. These may be discourage, mitigate, or delay the conquest. But in Paraguay, the human and natural ambience was especially hospitable to the imposition of a foreign tyranny, and successive political inbreeding of oppression has continued to sap the country's social and economic health. So you can see he's directly alluding to the United States government involvement in all of the South American mass murder genocides campaign against the people of the South American countries. He's talking specifically about Chile, Colombia, Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, and Haiti, Chile, Colombia, and Brazil. All of these countries he's describing, in addition to Paraguay, as examples of U.S. government mass murder and racist fraud, murderous genocidal campaign by their white frauds. Nature endowed the territory, which was to become the state of Paraguay, which features a veritable Urhawan, a gentle folk and a good land that provided its estimated 200,000 guard inhabitants with the wherewithal for a happy pre-Columbian life, meadows to graze their cattle, fields for their farming, forests for their lumber, sufficient water for their needs. It withheld the soil and gold and silver deposits and enticed the voracious Spanish colonizers to the Altiplano. Unfortunately, when the greedy cannot have gold, they settle for land. And if there are obstacles to their covetousness, these must be summarily dealt with, removed, or finally annihilated if necessary. This is the Paraguayan process that we are discussing, the uninterrupted sowing of tyranny leading to the contemporary blossoming of the Stroessner regime. In this complex context of necessity, our review is at best superficial, since we must select only the separate individual cumulative steps which help to explain today's ominous development. First came the Spaniards who took the land, dispossessing the occupants and using them as servants. These were followed by the Jesuits, zealous for converts, but not indifferent to profits. With an infinite efficiency and consummate skill, they collected the newly converted into communities, reorganizing the pattern of land, relocating the families at will, and consolidating them into a highly utilitarian unit where each learned a skill that could contribute into the greater benefit of the order. This process also included an agrarian reform of its kind, such as the parceling out of the fathers of the finest grazing and most fertile soil for planting, leaving the remaining desolate tracts for the subsistence of the country's erstwhile proprietors. After a century of this effective administration, the Jesuits were achieving a highly effective state within a state so effective that the crown and the agents expelled the Jesuits from Latin America. With them went the schools, the convents, and their profitable enterprises. This ended the Jesuit presence, but the effect of the coming and going exerted its dislocating trauma on the natives' life. Whether the Guarani themselves fled the new onslaught of Spaniards or were wiped out in the communities is not clear. 20 years later, records tell us that the 8 provinces in which the Jesuits flourished had diminished in population from over 21,000 to 9,000. Land-hungry Spaniards quickly filled the vacuum left by Jesuits. A little apart, they resisted efforts to oust them, even with visceral regal forces. They refused to involve themselves in the general wars of independence, then beginning, instead, they declared their own independence in 1811 and set up a government, a 3-man junta and an assembly of representatives. Independence from Spain brought an surcease to Paraguayans from the successive oppressions that had preceded. The 3-man junta and their assembly were quickly dispensed with by the strongest member of the 3, Jose Gaspar Rodriguez de Francia, a truly paranoid dictator. Trained for the church, a vocation which he repudiated, he became supreme unto himself. For El Suprema was the name he was pleased to be known by. First, having no intention to expose his rule to the comments of the outside world, he isolated the country and its people. The natural enclosure of Paraguay, then as we know, was a perfect habitat for troglodytic dictators. Despite the great waterway provided the Parana River, Paraguay retains its position as one of the 2 landlocked countries in Latin America. Like Bolivia, it remains at the mercy of its neighbors for outside venturing, while at the same time, it can hold the people at the mercy of the inside rulers. Left without witness, a country may indeed be subject to the caprices of ruler. And unlike Bolivia, which continues to shave for liberation from its geographic strictures, Paraguay's dictators have made a virtue of the country's geography in their war against the captive citizenry. Francia exploited this advantage of isolation to a degree that no one has since achieved. Although a kaleidoscope line of dictators that followed would have so wished. First of Paraguay's total rulers, Francia cemented the matrix of an enclave on Paraguay. It became his parish. Those who would become masters of the craft of tyranny could study his technique as a model. While precursors of Latin America freedom, San Martin, Bolivar, O'Higgins were committing themselves for the fight for human liberty, Francia remained ensconced in his Paraguayan lair. Critics of his rule were not suffered to exist. Torture and assassination thus early were inscribed into the social and political codes of Paraguayan practice, in lieu of the judicial process. Francia even went further. He broke relations with the Vatican, and after discharging its prelates, he named his own son. In the country and a half which followed, no one up to Stroessner has duplicated Francia's unremitting pursuit of perfection in tyranny. His followers lacked the intellectual and doctrinal equipment. Their own incentives were a native ambition for plunder and power, and perhaps out of their European inheritance, an innate hatred for the indigenous people. We need to cite only 1 or 2 of the successors, and only those whose acts consolidated the compost of this already deteriorated society. Francisco Solano Lopez, third of Paraguay's tyrants returned from sojourn in France with maximum arrogance and an Irish mistress, both of which nourished his frailties. They goaded him on to his final misadventure, a world with his three powerful neighbors, Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay, the War of the Triple Alliance. He died in the fray, but more tragic for the country. The war also reportedly took 1 million Paraguayan victims, virtually most of its men, and destroyed the land, leaving a population of 200,000 Guarani women and elders. These remained a quiescent prey for the succession of military usurpers who followed, each in turn, ousted by his predatory peers. Dictators rose and fell like tin soldiers until the Chaco War in 1932. To a certain degree, the Chaco War precipitated Paraguay into the modern way of life, by which we mean into an era when highly sophisticated techniques of bargaining for unprecedented personal profits were being offered to dictators susceptible to selling out their peoples. This war was presumably a border war over the claims of two neighbors, Bolivia and Paraguay. It seemed a futile struggle for a strip of impenetrable forest. But almost every country of Latin America has felt similar uneasy stirrings over its boundaries when the Spanish crown rewarded its colonizing favorites with enormous grants of land. It carelessly omitted setting precise limits to these prizes. The ambiguities continue to erupt into conflicts whenever a hitherto neglected strip of territory becomes unexpectedly profitable. The Chaco region assumed a new prominence with the invasion of multinational oil companies, avid for concessions, sufficient reasons to push two neighbors, Bolivia and Paraguay, into war. North American, British, and Dutch oil companies, vying for prerogatives in Latin America, found dictatorships highly amenable to their courtships, although the latter extracted no small rewards for granting away their country in largesse. Their stakes grow higher and higher in all negotiable commodities. And Paraguay, beginning even before the Chaco War, has rapidly put into pawn by its enterprising heads. One cannot blame only these avid and astute investors who seek their advantages in unexpected places. In a recent address in the Senate of Venezuela, supporting the acts of naturalization of the petroleum resources of the nation, Romulo Betancourt, one of the most experienced political observers of our times, made a statement which is applicable to probably every country of the world at some stage of its history. Si estas campañas han podido realizar en nuestro país explotación en porque han encontrado la complicidad de gobernantes sin interés o venales que no suspicion o no quisieron defender los intereses de su patria. And so it happens in Paraguay. The people find themselves dispossessed of their country, which has been mortgaged as a high interest to the dictator brokers. Both the liberty and the means of living of the people are in ransom. Out of the some 2.5 million population, perhaps 750,000 must go elsewhere, seeking political and economic asylum and living their peripheral existence in hope for the day when they may return to their native land. This economic sack of a country is in some form an invariable aspect of every dictatorship. Sometimes it becomes evident only after it is imperative that the dictator cement his hold as long as there are negotiable commodities. Witness the examples of Perez Jimenez, the Trujillo family, the Somozas, Batista, and others who managed to escape with their booty, even as their country's avengers were at their heels. So you can see he's referring to the oil companies. He's referring to the U.S. government, their mass murdering grows. Who put Somoza there? Who put Trujillo there? Who put Batista there? Who put Perez Jimenez there? All are United States puppet. Racist, white, mass murdering, fascist, sadistic, mentally deranged, anti-ethnic, cruel, detached butchers, the U.S. government, and he's also referring to the oil companies. The oil companies of British, American, and Dutch were, able to rape and plunder the lands of Paraguay and all of the South American lands for the sake of their oil cash and their racist white oppression. These are white frauds and savages of the U.S. government and their Western oil puppets. However, the 1940s added a new note to dictatorship in Latin America. The hold is now glorified by a credo, Nazi fascism. Here is the doctrine to rationalize the rise. I mentioned 1940, the year when Moringo came into power. It is no arbitrary date for the appearance of a new rationale for assassinations, tortures, and genocide in the Latin American scene. I can personally testify to the spreading of that poison as it spilled over the year from the oozing cauldrons of Italy and Germany. In my voyages around South America during the 40s, I became alarmingly conscious of how the lands of South had become a new battlefield for converts. Nazi and phalangists were losing no time in sending their agents in this region of potential conquest. The agents spoke of Hispanidad and the master race. And polarization was rapidly in the making. Oscar Schneck, the most astute socialist leader of Chile, described it perceptively to me thus: our Chileans to the south have long forgotten they were descendants of the Germans. They are now being prodded to remember, and like old war horses out of battle, they begin to dance when they hear the sound of the martial music. Perón in Argentina needed no persuasion to dance to that tune. He was a practicing addict ever since his sojourn in fascist Italy. It is also alleged by the great Argentine fighter for his country's freedom, Silvano Santander, that Perón and Evita were highly paid agents of Hitler. Moringo, then Paraguay's dictator, in his position as a satellite and debtor of his Argentine confrere, gave every evidence of being a devotee to Nazi doctrine and techniques. United States attempts to counteract this cultural war for loyalties in great part came late and seemed improvised and surprisingly naive. The U.S. might have suffered further setbacks in the contest had it not been fortified by its pecuniary enticement to the dictators. More important, the essentially democratic spirit of other Latin American leaders and the unquestioned affection which Latin Americans as a whole felt for the attractive and expansive personality of Franklin Roosevelt and their faith in his shibboleth of the good neighbor sustained U.S. efforts. As we know, Latin America's adhesion to the Allied cause was not entirely unanimous. In some countries, it was not even spontaneous. It had to be gained by pressures. As for Paraguay, its spurious commitment exposed itself by the hearty welcome accorded to Nazi escapees after Germany's defeat. Certainly both Argentina and Paraguay, and in other dictatorial states, these renegades were received as welcome newcomers. Even more, the Nazis became mentors of the dictators, prison guards, with the local police establishments, sharing an expertise won in the concentration camps of Europe. In protesting against the thousands of political prisoners in Latin America at that date, some 30,000, the International League for Human Rights and Inter-American Association for Democracy and Freedom reported how new expert methods of torture were coming into vogue in the dictator's prison of the Americas. In the archives of our several organizations, I find revealing material on this theme, communications attesting to the presence of a Nazified Paraguayan police force in the concentration camps installed in Paraguay. I present revealing passages of one of these documents, dated 1946 and written in their associations from Buenos Aires after the Inter-American Labor Conference was held in that Argentine city. It is an appeal dispatched in desperation by other exiled Paraguayan labor leaders. Our companion, Jose Acosta, who was in our delegation on returning to our country, was taken prisoner by the Paraguayan Gestapo, which is directed by Marcos Fuster, chief of the investigations of Moringo. We have word that he is being tortured constantly. It is easy to explain the fury with which he Nazified Paraguayan police are acting against this leader of the laboring class, since he has devoted many years to the democratic struggle of our country. He has become the secretary of the Council of Workers, Consejo Obrero Sindical, and enjoys serious and merited prestige among the democratic ranks of our country. The promises of the amnesty which General Moringo has lately made to the foreign press last January 10 is only one motive that we can deduce from the known facts, to avoid serious confrontations at the coming conference of foreign ministers soon to be held in Rio de Janeiro. In addition, still secure in his positions as Chief of General Staff is Colonel B. Arendra, whose recent book evoked a note of protest for its shameless Nazi content from the North American Secretary of State of the United States to the Paraguayan government. Also in the post are Major Stagny, whose character has been sufficiently exposed in the North American and American United States press, and the head of the cavalry of the Campo Grande, Colonel Benito Vera, whose anti-democratic activities are notorious. These military men who occupy the strategic positions in the branches of the armed forces constitute the base of Nazi Camarilla, which rules Paraguay and which makes the decisions for the most important activities of the government. Of the same period is a communication directly to Marengo that protests the numerous concentration camps set up by chambers of torture and Puerto Muñecas, Lopez de Felipe Camacho, Alto Parana, and the city of Concepcion. In these, according to the information, a great number of prisoners are being submitted to torture and forced labor. Lack of housing and proper food for these political prisoners are contributing to their debilitated physical condition. The communication also cites the names of prisoners, including some eminent Paraguayan leaders, the location of camps in which they are detained, and lists of these, as well as the political prisoners already assassinated by the police in the city of Concepcion. Marengo remained in office until 1948, one of the few heads of Paraguay to leave his office without the armed persuasions of his confreres. Festering questions continue to perplex students of the Latin American scene. By what peculiar gifts did Marengo retain the power without the least uneasiness? Certainly, he had the blessings of a neighboring Argentina, but United States support of him was puzzling, given his apparent flirtation with causes inimical to the Allies and his notorious affronts to the rights of his own people. Yet this was at a period when the United Nations Charter was already in existence, and the Charter of the Organization of Nations of American States had formulated its doctrine of human rights. None of the pockets of Paraguayan contamination seemed to reach the conscience of the world. Quite otherwise, Marengo's final years in office were enhanced by his gratifying visits to other Americas, ending in his hearty reception in the United States and with the laurels of an honorary degree from Fordham University. So you can see Marengo was a Nazi dictator that the United States gave him a nice reception after being a mass murderer and concentration camp abuser in South America. It seems the U.S. government, even though they, fought Hitler, they had some friends in Hitler. It was, definitely a racist friendship. The Southern Confederates, just like the South African, affinity, they had an affinity to Adolf Hitler. Just like the South Africans loved Adolf Hitler, the U.S. government loved Adolf Hitler when they were in power, when he was in power in Germany. And that is why they installed his puppets and made his puppets big people, big Nazis in South America, were, agents of the U.S. government after World War II. And his symbiotic relationship between Paraguay and the United States has continued. The 6 years which intervened between Marengo's retirement and Stroessner's usurpation of power were filled by three rapidly changing dictatorships. In 1954, Stroessner, with great talents for political self-perpetuation, shows no evidence of leaving his post at any foreseeable date. He is a so-called elected head of state by a device often utilized by similarly situated ad hoc rulers. He altered the Constitution of Paraguay in 1968 to legalize his continuity and devised election which prescribes his own victories. He has thus perpetuated his governments. In addition, he has set up a parliament and created puppet opposition parties, sagaciously assuring, however, that 2/3 of the parliament must be of his political persuasion, while the remaining third is divided among the diversion-simulated opponents. A perpetual state of siege has existed almost throughout Stroessner's regime, and its brief intermissions are but preludes to its renewal. Not only has there been no diminution in the practices of tyranny, but these continue with augmented and unremitting frequency. True, the press of the world rarely publishes the tedious chronicle, since there is a saying and a practice among journalists that nothing is so stale as the news of yesterday. And so the atrocities and the imprisonments, silently and unnoticed, pass into the limbo, quickly giving way to others equally concealed. So you can see he's alluding to U.S. press fraud, U.S. government press fraud, it's U.S. mass media fraud, the white corporates, the racist mass murder, accomplices. They're, sadistic, cruel, anti-ethnic, hateful corporates of the New York Times, Washington Post, and all of the U.S. mass media, very similar to their government, mass murdering white savages. Of course, it would be unjust to imply that there were no courageous Paraguayan voices calling out to the conscience of the world on behalf of their assaulted compatriots and against their malignancy within. Authentic opposition parties still function in exile, awaiting in optimistic patience. Among them are Februarista, who belong to the fraternity of the Democratic left in the hemisphere. There are also Liberal Party in exile and the Colorado Party in exile. The so-called Colorado Party is the banner under which Stroessner and the dictatorship before him have carried on their political self-perpetuation. Within Paraguay itself are the church and student bodies and amazing individuals who have bravely raised their voices to protest against the atrocities to their colleagues, but they do so knowing that they can expect certain reprisals in the forms of imprisonment or torture or some other form of violence from the brutal squads of Stroessner's gall letters. From time to time, these fighters for freedom have had fleeting moments of hope, such, for instance, as the announcement of the Alliance for Progress, which was to be predicated on the degree to which countries respect human rights, or the visit of Adlai Stevenson, who they thought might expose to the U.S. the true state of their country. But these and other similar moments of hope passed, and the unimpeded oppressions continue. Of course, in addition to the continued vampirism against the rights of the people, there is the hopelessness of living conditions of the country is rife with the political and social rot, and every petty public officer preying on his fellows, where contraband, subordination, even trafficking in drugs, apparently by the higher echelons of government, are the rule of each day, while deprivations in some form face the larger number of the population. While particular stories of torture can we choose out of what particular stories of torture can we choose of the continuing epic? There is an awesome sameness in these successive testimonies of cruelty. He, like a broken record that repeats its phrases over and over, but here a phrase is a dirge, and the subjects are human. Let us end with a recent communication from Argentina, dated December 22nd, 1975. We read at least 30 persons were imprisoned in the last 2 weeks in a new wave of repressions by the political police, who up to this announcement have given out no reasons. Among those being held incommunicado in the Department of Interrogations are Professor Miguel Chase Sardi, noted anthropologist who was completing a project intended to rescue and defend the autonomy of the indigenous Paraguayan community. Also imprisoned with him is the educator Marisa Schwartzman, professor of sociology at the Catholic University and also the Faculty of Architecture of the National University. Other persons among those identified are 8 young high school students, among them 2 girls. According to the university sources, these arrests are related to the constant working conflicts with the Catholic University that it is now experiencing. It should nevertheless not be overlooked that this is a new repressive wave in the forceful tightening of the regime, long apparent in the persecution of radical leaders and the closing of the seminary. Now it is being extended to other parties and political movements of the opposition. This is the news of one day, but it duplicates the news of the day before, which noted 100 persons were arrested and their whereabouts unknown. It parallels as well the news of 1956, with Stroessner already in power, which I read in affidavits of imprisonments and torture in my files. And certainly in the present state of Stroessner's Paraguay, it will also be in the news of tomorrow. Many other incidents remain unrecorded, yet each, even in the silence, must remain a reproof to intergovernmental communities whose failure to fulfill their goals of protecting the dignity of man is serving to swell the arrogance and cynicism of the world's tyrants. So you can see, excellent book. I think it's an excellent discussion. You can see all of that is, truthful. All of that is truthful. The U.S. government, they're, mass murder, sadistic, anti-ethnic, hateful butchers They placed Mr. Stroessner in power. And this is a colonel from the Paraguayan military who was imprisoned and had to leave, was able to escape prison in Paraguay. This is how you treat people. This is the way the U.S. government treats its colonial subjects. This is what they call colonialism. This is what you expect if they take over your oil in South America. This is the kind of treatment you'll expect. They'll, rape your land, plunder your resources, and imprison all people who read books or have any question of why the Europeans are mass murderers, why the Americans are mass murderers, why do they, cause ethnic slaughter across the world. You should be very concerned about the U.S. government. They are really, really dangerous, sadistic, mentally ill butchers. Let's not forget their sadistic cruelty, their genocidal ideation, their homicidal ideations, and their hate, their ethnic hate and detachment from ethnic hate, as well as their, inability to feel remorse for their actions of genocide and mass murder are examples of psychiatric symptoms. Nobody murders people and then doesn't feel remorse. That is the mark of a crazy, mass murdering animal. Like an animal. Lower animals have such non-guilty and non-shaming approaches to emotion. So the U.S. government is behaving like animals. Lower animals are the way they are behaving in their vicious mass murder campaigns. You must feel, pity. You must feel sadness when you murder people with, undocumented murders, with cover-ups of murders. It means you are reckless and remorseless in your murders. And that is the U.S. government. That is their white supremacist, mass murdering butchers. So we're going to talk just a minute. It's going to be a short thing. And, we went through most of it. But, I want to just go through one more thing. So this is with respect to the El Salvadoran conflict and Jimmy Carter. Basically, in El Salvador's Washington's War on Nicaragua book, it's a book by Holly Scar. I can show you the cover. This is the book. It's by Holly Scar, Washington's War on Nicaragua. Basically, it says that it goes through the whole El Salvador story, page 50 to 56, and discusses both the church complicity with Pope John Paul II, who met with Carter, as well as the lies of the U.S. government that the Sandinistas were supplying arms to the El Salvadoran rebels. It was concluded by the World Court that the United States was lying, and that was a violation of international law that the World Court found that the United States was lying. And as a result of the lying, they went to war with Nicaragua from 1979 to 1981. There were no actual flow of arms demonstrated. There was no evidence to indicate flow of arms from Nicaragua to El Salvador. And it was all fabricated evidence, including the Gulf of Finasca incident, which the American government to this day denies that the court's findings reflect reality and believes that there was arms flow, even though they haven't provided any documentation. This is a racist, fraud group of white savages, sadistic mass murdering, anti-ethnic, hateful, detached, remorseless butchers of the U.S. government. And so, and there's just one little thing on the Mexicans versus the Spanish versus the United States. I was reading a little bit in another book. It's about Spanish conquest, conquest of the Indians. It's called Colonial. The name of the book is called The Cycles of Conquest by Edward Spicer. This is the name of the book. Basically, it compares the Spanish, the Mexicans, and the United States on the Indians of the Southwest. So I'm going to just give a summary of what I read, and I think you should buy the book. It's very cheap and available on Amazon. It's basically, it says the United States and the South American Indians require us to compare the personalities of the American white racist savage frauds, the Spanish and the Mexicans. What seems clear is that the Americans were angry white savages. They gave the Indians no rights that the white man need respect. And that was reflected in their vicious campaigns against the Indians, their resettling to reservations, their genocide against the American Indians. This compares with the Spanish, who respected the rights, who mingled with the people, who mixed with the indigenous population. That is why many of these South American countries have many mixed races. Indians and Spanish mixed together and created a mixed culture and population. The white frauds, American racist, sadistic, cruel anti-ethnic butchers are jealous of that fact. And that is why they curtailed Indians in South America. They continue to chase Indians in South America with vicious genocidal campaigns like the Achi Indians and the Guayaki Indians, as well as several of the Indians in the Brazilian mountains. They chase them with ethnic slaughter. This is again a white racist fraud, and it comes from the seething temper of their Confederates. It is the same savage temper as the lynchings of the blacks, the lynchings of the Chinese, and the lynchings of the Mexicans all over America. It shows their white racist, white supremacist, savage, anti-ethnic, hateful action, and their mentally ill cover-ups, reflecting their sadism, hate, and remorseless murder. The Indians of the South, the Indians of South America, are way better off than the Indians of the United States that were slaughtered in a genocidal campaign by the white supremacist frauds, the racist frauds of the American government. Just an additional point, we discussed the oil, and I had said that basically the Iran war, the Al Jazeera, and even the big news places are basically changing the stories because of the way the war has gone. Al Jazeera and all of the major papers that are reporting on this war are presenting fraud. Like it is almost all, basically fraud. This is because the white oil companies that are in racist colonial governments, including the Oil Western Racist Coalition, have been seen in the United States, Britain, France, Portugal, and Netherlands. All of these countries are in dealing with large oil reserves in the Middle East, including Dubai and Abu Dhabi, which have large oil-rich reserves. It comes from the Emirates, the Al Jazeera paper. So that is why you're going to see fraud in all of the newspapers in the Iran war, because the Western coalition is doing this in a secretive way. It is a colonialist war of oppression because the oil companies want to see colonial exploitation and they want to see resources for their oil companies. Free resources. They can just hook up their pipelines and steal Iranian oil, and that's the goal of this campaign. It's exactly the same as it happened in Venezuela. They want to keep the oil resources under their system of racist vigilante white oppression. It is part of a campaign for government lynching. If it succeeds, all of the Western governments will lynch the Iranian ethnics, including Portugal, France, Brazil, Netherlands, and the United States. And they will enact vigilante-style white justice in Iran against the poor Iranian ethnics, similar to the way it took in 1964 when they, put away, in 1979 when the Shah of Iran was finally overthrown in the Iranian government. The Shah of Iran was overthrown by the, Iranian Revolution. But until then, he murdered his people, he tortured his people, he executed his people, he, mutilated his people, he cut their arms off and legs off. The same basic thing that the U.S. government does anytime. Basically, part of the war is murdering the people, keeping them in a state of white, sadistic, cruel, anti-ethnic, butcher-type oppression, a state of complete subservience to the colonial whites. And that is why the oil companies force cheating by the media through cash transfer, typical white American bribery journalism, with this racist war aggression by the United States. Again, I told you the mental illness of the U.S. government is clear. They have homicidal ideation, genocidal ideation, and all symptoms of mental illness, including remorselessness, lack of remorselessness, or lack of guilt for its anti-ethnic sadism and cruelty that is only found in lower animals. Humans have evolved these appropriate moral cues, but the whites of America haven't been included in this evolution. That is the U.S. government's politicians' approach to war and ethnic cruelty in all of their campaigns of mass murder. So I hope you enjoyed it. I'll be back in 2 days with the remainder of the book. I'm going to be presenting one chapter per day. I strongly urge you to buy this book or get it on my website. The website is not up, but I will put it up. But, be able to at least listen to the podcast. I'll put some of my notes in the discussion section. But for the most part, I'm not going to have too much in the description section today because I drew it from multiple sources. I'll just have a little discussion on the oil. So otherwise, hope you enjoyed it. Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. Have a great day.